There's a long backstory to my family life in Mexico. And for complicated reasons that aren't worth going into today, our family had to drive from Mexico City up to the border every 6 months, basically to renew a sticker on our Ford LTD station wagon. And you spend about 12 hours driving through dusty Mexican roads, and you'd finally arrive at a town called McAllen, Texas. And for the longest period of time, I considered McAllen, Texas to be heaven on earth. I was just astonished that you could turn on the tap, put a glass under it, and drink the water without having to boil it first. This was the era before mass-produced bottled water. I was astonished that if you went to the cinema, you watched a movie, it wouldn't be interrupted by a government-sponsored intermission lasting half an hour, amounting to basically ruling party propaganda, which was the norm in Mexico. And then years later, I went back to McAllen when I was an adult. I thought, this is a nothing town. I mention this to say that when you grow up as an American outside of the United States, you become fervently, or ought to become fervently in love with what the United States is. So that's, I think, the fundament of my political outlook, understanding, because I grew up outside of it, just how unique the US is, in a way that I don't think I would have appreciated had I grown up here in Greenwich or somewhere else in America. The second point I would say is I grew up in a household that was as minimally Jewish as you can get without being actually Unitarian. On the other hand, we were fervent Zionists, and Zionism was a part of my life from as long as I can remember. My mother was born a displaced person in Nazi-occupied Europe and came to this country when she was 10 years old after the war. She only learned she was Jewish once she was in this country. Her cousins moved to Israel. I first went to Israel when I was about 9 years old, and I had this sense that here was this wonderful country. So long before I really had any thoughts on Jewish ethical life, I had a sense that Israel is a terrific country that commands, or ought to command, support, and that developed over the years. I guess the third part of it was that my father, when we grew up in Mexico, was running a company, or helping to run a family-owned business in a sclerotic, essentially socialist or state-run economy. And so part of my early political lessons from my father weren't really political, they were just his complaints about having to deal with companies like Pemex, the state-owned oil company, and how awful they were and inefficient and stupid. And that kind of gave me an appreciation of the benefits of a free market. I guess the last point I would make is I'm sometimes called this conservative columnist. I try to think for myself, and if you talk to me on social views, I think you'll find me much more in sympathy with the Democratic Party than with the Republican Party, definitely the Republican Party in its current iteration. But I have a view that the United States has a role to play in this world, that a strong America, and that's also a militarily strong America, is indispensable, that we can't walk away from that role, that there's no substitute for us, and that goes far towards explaining how I think about my columns. I wasn't hugely coherent. The philosophy of the Wall Street Journal is free people, free markets, which has a nice ring to it, but that's sort of the streams that end up informing my point of view.
I guess I'll go with the Mexico and the United States, because there's been talk about a wall and other things in the current political discourse, of course, and I guess that helps us raise a very important question, which is the state of conservatism in America today. You probably agree that conservatism is in a state of crisis. What can we conclude about the state of the conservative movement, given the fact that the Republican Party's frontrunner is someone with dubious conservative credentials? And what does it say, perhaps more importantly, about the diverging interests of conservative elites and much of the Republican electorate?
Let me start by saying that if anyone in this room is worried that our porous borders might result in jihadis making their way to the United States to cause mayhem, we need immediately to build a wall with Canada. Because in fact, there are larger Muslim and potentially jihadist populations in Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver than there are in Veracruz or wherever, Querétaro, San Luis Potosí, any place in Mexico that I know of. So if your idea is that an immigration policy is also a form of national security, by all means, the 49th parallel is totally exposed, and take precaution. I've always been of the view that immigrants serve this country magnificently well. My mother came to this country with her mother with $7 between them. My grandmother was a seamstress. They were not high-value PhD, H-1B labor. They were very poor people who came to this country with nothing. And we ought to all be reminded when we think of where we came from that probably our ancestor who set foot on this country didn't come here with a PhD or $1 million business idea. That was left to the next generation. So that's one point that I stress, because so much of current conservatism, or what passes for conservatism, is so vitriolically anti-immigrant. And I understand it's anti-illegal immigration, although a lot of that often shades into just anti-immigration, period. But that's an important philosophical point. The question is, are the roots of our strength something like nationhood, Americanness, or is the root of our strength openness to the world? I mean, not stupid openness to the world, not the kind of openness that you now have in Europe with hordes of people kind of coming in the way they are, but a sense that this is a country where only a few of us are daughters of the American Revolution. I guess that's one point. That's one point of departure. A second point is that you need a conservative movement in this country that is respectful of the moral beliefs and traditions of traditional moral beliefs and convictions. But you want a conservative movement that also isn't simply a scold. The Republican Party at its best is a party of liberty. And liberty is not simply economic liberty. Economic liberty is a huge component of liberty, but personal liberty, what Thomas Jefferson called the pursuit of happiness, ought to be a part of any conservative movement. The conservative movement ought to have a smiling, not scowling face toward people with whom we don't necessarily agree all the time. And what I worry about the current Republican frontrunners is that the scowl is the expression that dominates. There's very little optimism in the current conservative, or I should say the current crop of Republican frontrunners. Now, all of this worries me because when I look at the Democratic Party, I look at Bernie Sanders, who would probably lock up half the people in this room, or anyone who has a job on Wall Street. I don't think of that as a particularly hopeful prospect, and it worries me that he's attracting so much rank-and-file Democratic support. And I worry, too, when I look at Hillary Clinton essentially tilting in Bernie's direction in order to appease that constituency. We did well with a Democratic Party that understood the virtues of free market, free trade, a great, open, competitive, capitalist system. So I've been writing this series of columns about Donald Trump because I can't think of, my brain can barely, muster enough space to think about anything else. But there's a lot to be concerned about on the other side. Then again, I guess I'll make one last point. Precisely because I'm identified as a right-of-center writer, I think I have perhaps a special responsibility to police, if that's the word, the conservative, police is probably the wrong word, I'm going to get into trouble for that, but to stand up against aspects of the conservative movement which I think are ugly and have no place in it. In the 1940s, Democrats like Arthur Schlesinger said hardline communists can have no place in the Democratic Party. And in the 1950s, conservatives like William F. Buckley said rank anti-Semites can have no place in a conservative movement. And that's the health, the political health of a nation, when the adults on both sides of the aisle say, you know, we have kooks on our own side, and we're going to try to make sure that they don't end up seizing the intellectual reins from those of us who are, whatever our other differences, serious and civilized people.
Drawing upon some of what you've just been saying, I'd like to point out, as I've spoken to some of the other people in the audience this evening already, the fact that other conservatives, Robert Kagan, Max Boot, David Brooks, and so forth, even if they're more on the centrist end of the conservative spectrum, they've become increasingly critical not only of Trump, but of the GOP's own role or culpability in his rise. And you yourself have recently stated in the Journal, you went so far as to write, quote, "It would be terrible to think that the left was right about the right all these years." Now, obviously you phrase that in a conditional sense, and I guess I'm curious how you would answer your own question at this point. Is the left correct? And if not, to what degree might it be at least onto something?
I still haven't arrived at the answer. I only wrote that column, I think, 9 days ago, so give me, let's see. Bear in mind, Donald Trump has about 35% support in this electorate, which often is an electorate that, by the way, includes independents who are voting in Republican primaries for the first time. So I don't want to tar and feather, you know, every Republican voter as, in some sense, responsible for the rise of Trump. What I will say is that people in, say, talk radio, certain television personalities, talked or whipped a segment of the traditional Republican base into a kind of frenzy. I've only started listening to him because he attacks me every other day, but there's this character, Mark Levin. One of the blessings of living in New York City is I don't have a car. I know this makes me virtually un-American, but I don't own a car, so I don't have to get in the car, turn on the radio, and tune into these guys. But, you know, guys like Mark Levin, Rush Limbaugh, keep talking about immigration, which is a serious issue, and an issue on which reasonable people can disagree, as an invasion. So suddenly we're being invaded by Mexicans. The guy who delivers the pizza to my door is my invader, apparently. That's part of it. Then there was, quite frankly, way too much airtime given to really conspiratorial notions. I happen to think, okay, that Obama is a bad president. You may not agree. I think he's a bad president. I do not think Barack Obama is a bad man. I think he kisses his daughters to sleep and loves his wife and means well by the country. I happen to disagree with him, you know, vehemently on all kinds of things, but something turned in a lot of the rhetoric on the right, where suddenly this was a guy who was essentially a Manchurian candidate. He was actively conspiring against the United States. He had a scheme to bring us down. You know, this was sort of the view. I tend to think of Barack Obama kind of like a liberal college professor who, you know, had a political gift and became the president. And I don't agree with, you know, all kinds of things. But that too, I think, added a log or two to the fire of sort of this burning conservative anger. Look, a third point that I don't think you can discount is, okay, we're not in a depression or a recession, but we've had 7 years of basically very mediocre economic growth. The United States is accustomed to 3–4% economic growth. We've been getting maybe 2% economic growth. And that really matters on the margin, and I'll tell you where it matters. If you were 50 years old in 2008 and you got laid off of your, say, middle-income job, my guess is you have struggled mightily to get back on your feet, and you may not have found a job at the level when you left the job market. Now this is anecdotal, and maybe this is the worst form of journalism, but often when I'm in a car and it's a drive, it's a limo car, I'll start chatting with the drivers, usually middle-aged white guys who are driving the car, and they'll tell you their stories. And a lot of these guys have college degrees and work middle-income jobs, and now they're driving a limo. I know this is anecdotal, it's not data, but I think it's illustrative. I think a great many Americans who had middle-income lives and middle-income dreams in 2007 have experienced the Obama years having neither. And that, I think, fuels an incredible sense of rage. And I think that's part of the Trump base. People say unemployment is 4.9 or 4.8%. That doesn't take into account the labor participation rate. That doesn't take into account the huge number of Americans who simply gave up looking for jobs or retired at age, 57, and by 65 kind of slipped into a permanent retirement. And I think that is part of the Trump phenomenon.
Right, and pointing out the role of the Rush Limbaughs and the Michael Savages and the Mark Levins and so forth. What would one have to say about the Republican establishment, the Ted Cruz's, the Tea Party in general, the Mitch McConnell wanted to make Barack Obama one-term president, all these kinds of remarks? In a sense, if you look at the other leaders of the GOP field right now, one could say that some of them are bordering on nihilistic in the sense of just not wanting to get anything done. Is the obstructionism that's existed, and I'm not saying it's only a one-way street, but is the obstructionism that's been undeniable from the Republican Party in the last 8 years, has that not also made many Americans cynical about government's ability to get anything done, to the point where they need really to have an outsider come in and rescue everyone, which is why Rubio and why somebody like Jeb Bush, they get no traction?
I'm always amused to find myself described as a member of the Republican establishment. Whenever someone says that, I wonder where my butler, decamped to as I'm picking up after my young children or something of the sort. Look, Mitch McConnell saying, I want to make Obama a one-term president is just truth in advertising. Of course he did. He's the Republican leader of the opposition in the Senate. That's what opposition leaders want to do. And I've never quite understood why so much has been made of that perfectly blitheringly obvious comment. Of course, every opposition party wants to make an incumbent first-term president a one-term president. Look, it's a complicated question you're asking, and it doesn't lend itself to kind of a neatly packaged answer. But I would make a couple of points. Steve Jobs was quoted, I think, in Walter Isaacson's biography as complaining about Obama because there was a real opportunity for immigration reform early on, at least when it came to H-1B visa reform, so that companies like Apple could bring in highly skilled outsiders or foreigners who had BAs from American universities and didn't want to go home. And Obama simply refused to do so because he was afraid of his own labor unions and that constituency, which was also against immigration reform. So this view that somehow people say obstructionism and the automatic reflex is it's Republicans, it doesn't square with.
Could I ask one question about the 2011 infrastructure bill, the $60 billion bill, where $10 of every spending cut was going to be met with $1 of tax increase in the Republican establishment? The people in the Senate and House basically said, we're not going to do this. And in fact, in the 2012 debate, every candidate said a 10-to-1 deal is not realistic. I mean, most Americans, I think, if they had a fair mind, would probably say if Democrats and Republicans wanted to get something done, could meet in the middle, 50-50 cuts and tax hikes, that would be equitable. But 10-to-1 wasn't even accepted at the time.
Yeah.
And that just, I think, in terms of the rhetoric, that certainly does lead a lot of people, I imagine, to think that Washington is just completely incompetent, which is bad for all parties.
Okay, well, this leads me to the second point, which is that we suffer from a certain kind of constitutional or political illiteracy in this country. In that the premise of your question is that the role of Washington is to get stuff done. If you read the Constitution, if you understand the whole system of government that we have, the whole system is designed to gum up the works and not get stuff done because it should be done at some lower level. So having infrastructure spending blowouts isn't necessarily what we thought a free government was supposed to do. Now, by the way, on the tax issue, I mean, I guess this just betrays what a hardline conservative I am. I would have taken that pledge as well. I think we're overtaxed as it is in this country, not undertaxed. When I think of infrastructure boondoggles like this incredible train station that's just gone up for $4 billion in Lower Manhattan that serves no identifiable purpose other than the vanity of Santiago Calatrava, I'm not exactly sure that this sort of infrastructure spending is always meets its best purposes. I'd much rather have individuals at lower levels of accountability do that. But you see, now I'm letting you know that I'm really this hardcore Wall Street Journal editorial page conservative who doesn't believe in tax hikes.
Well, I certainly don't want to move, I don't want to focus everything on domestic policy, so I think the best transitional question that will get us from the domestic to the foreign arena is the following question, which also draws on another recent column that Rabbi Mitch actually circulated to everyone in the congregation. You recently wrote that the political situation, and you're not the only one to do this, of course, in the US resembles, or at least is reminiscent of the 1930s in Europe, and that we better heed the lessons from that decade. Perhaps you'd be willing to sum up your argument and address the question of whether comparisons between Donald Trump and the present-day conservative movement in the US, whether there's any comparison between 1930s era fascism and Nazism, and maybe you would reflect on whether or not those kinds of comparisons are possibly examples of rhetorical overreach, and maybe if the better example, the better comparison might not be to Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan, George Wallace, rather than Hitler and Mussolini. And I'm not singling you out here with this comparison, this is par for the course.
No, I'm glad, because this treats the column I wrote for this week.
And I should, by the way, add that I asked my question as a German historian whose specialty is the period of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust.
Well, look, number of points. I was amused by a number of readers who wrote me saying, how dare you compare Donald Trump to Benito Mussolini? Which I wasn't doing, as a matter of fact. I was saying we ought to think about some of this. But really I was comparing Mussolini's followers to the people I derisively call the Trumpkins. So I don't, in fact, I think of Trump more of a Berlusconi character, although nastier in many respects than Berlusconi. Let's not forget, by the way, that Mussolini didn't arrive in power as an out-and-out anti-Semite, determined to make an alliance with the Nazis. There was a clownish character to Mussolini as well. And people said, well, you're saying Mussolini, you really mean Hitler. I know the difference between Mussolini and Hitler. My mother was born in Milan, and I know the history. And so Mussolini, part of the problem rhetorically is people say, you can never make a comparison to the 30s. Well, you should be cautious with the comparisons, but you're denying a good part of history when you say you must never ever make them. And now the comparisons are in some ways quite striking. Why was it that the sort of nascent liberal democratic order before World War I and then in the immediate aftermath of Versailles and the creation of these democracies in Czechoslovakia and Poland, why did that all collapse so suddenly? Why was it that in the liberal democratic world there were suddenly these deep doubts about whether liberal democracy was in fact the best form of government, whether it could deliver the goods, whether you wanted politicians or you wanted leaders, whether you wanted ideas and principles or you wanted charisma. And to read the history of the interwar years is to be struck by how deep those doubts were about the sort of goodness, efficiency, effectiveness of liberal democracy, and the temptations that created for strongman politics. And I think I'm starting to listen to Trump supporters today. These are people who have who aren't listening to Trump. They're kind of feeling Trump. And Trump is channeling essentially a great deal of rage. And he's taking that rage and just saying stuff. And, listen to these speeches and it's kind of, what are you talking about? I mean, the moment you turn on your brain, you say, this is errant nonsense, or this is factually wrong, or this is a transparent lie, right? And yet, what I find worrying is that as the lies have accumulated and have been exposed, as the insults have accumulated, McCain was just a jerk who got captured. Megyn Kelly is a menstruating moron. A New York Times journalist who suffers from a neurological disease is, some kind of blithering. I mean, horrible things. This hasn't diminished Trump. It's increased his popularity. People are saying, well, he says it like it is. No, he's not. He's just a jerk.
Wouldn't you say that I think we can all clap and agree with that. But what about the question of his boorish personality and every other deficiency notwithstanding, that the same people who are voting for Trump now were the same people largely voting for Pat Buchanan in '96, voting for Perot in '92, voting for George Wallace, maybe Strom Thurmond even back in the '40s. There is a hostility to free trade, there's a hostility towards the other immigrants, there is this belief that trade is something that we're going to have net losses from. I'm sure, obviously, you disagree with that perspective, and Justin Trudeau's trade minister was on CNN earlier today talking about how 9 million American jobs depend on trade with Canada and over $1 trillion. So clearly, there are things that people don't know factually, but there does seem to be a tendency since the early 90s for the same voter base to be looking for some kind of charismatic leader on the right. And I'm sure there's some overlap with the Bernie Sanders crowd on the left, but doesn't the European analogy take us too far afield, away from maybe where the focus ought to be?
Well, look, I mean, analogies serve purposes in terms of helping you think these things through. And I don't think that the European analogy does us such a disservice. We are in a moment in which suddenly a form of crude charismatic politics is appealing to a very large segment of voters that at some point in the past would have been kind of ashamed. I imagine 10 years ago people would have said, yeah, I kind of like Donald Trump saying, let's ban all Muslims, but the guy can't be president, right? And now the difference isn't that, the real difference is they've become a little more shameless in their political preferences, and so they're more willing to openly express that kind of admiration. Just as many French years ago could never imagine admitting that they secretly liked 50% or 70% of the Le Penist message, and now in more dire economic circumstances and a probably more corrosive political environment, they're suddenly pulling the voting lever for not Jean-Marie, but Marine Le Pen. But look, again, no, we're not in the 1930s, but the 1930s was an important year in history, not least because suddenly, because of a combination of circumstances, economic, social, and ideological, there was suddenly a temptation in the West to go for the politics of strength and charisma over the politics of compromise and representation and kind of the mediocre qualities of democratic small d politics, and that was what I was really trying to draw. By the way, as a matter of history, the first historian I know to draw the Mussolini-Trump comparison explicitly was Andrew Roberts, who I don't think yields to anyone in his understanding of the 1920s and 30s.
We can talk about Andrew Roberts another time. In any case, it's a perfect segue to the realm of foreign policy, and you're of course very distinguished in your writing on American foreign policy, and I suppose the place to begin here is how you would rank the GOP and Democratic field in terms of their foreign policy credentials, number one, and then of course because of our audience this evening, I won't ask the nakedly self-interested question, who's better for the Jews, but on Israel, Trump, Clinton, other candidates, Israel has always been in a difficult situation. Geopolitically, how would we be able to expect the current field to weigh in on foreign policy issues pertaining to the Middle East?
I am barred by Wall Street Journal ethical rules from offering political endorsements. So I tend to do so by offering political disendorsements. So I'm a little bit hesitant as the field narrows. The only way to answer your question is by disendorsing so many candidates that you would be left to have a clear sense of my political preferences. So let me often kind of evade the question, and I'm sort of required to evade it, and offer some more general thoughts. Number one, in theory, everyone is pro-Israel, right? With the exception of, Cynthia McKinney and some kooky politicians here and there, everyone says they're pro-Israel. And if that's an issue that you care about, you have to say, okay, what is the standard by which we say you're really pro-Israel? And I would say that a large part of that is to say whether you like only an idealized version of the country or you like the country as it is, warts and all. Whether you're a friend to Israel when it comes to, funding Iron Dome, which is the easiest vote since, naming, post offices after Rosa Parks or something like that, or whether your notion of Israel's security goes to something like the Iran deal, which I think was catastrophic for the United States and very dangerous for Israel. So are you in the pro-Israel camp when the votes are easy or when the votes are hard? Let me give you an example of what I meant by the first case. Obama has often said, I love Israel of the kibbutzim, the Israel of Moshe Dayan, and it's what he's trying to say is, I love the old Israel of that plucky little country fighting for its freedom behind the 67 borders. I don't think he understands that the Israel of pre-1967 was a racist Israel. It was an Israel that treated its Sephardic community as second-class citizens. It was an economically sclerotic or not particularly efficient Israel. It was an Israel of connections, of who you knew in the Histadrut and whatever. It wasn't such a perfect little emblem of happiness. Modern Israel today is vastly more inclusive, democratic, robust, open, tolerant, self-examining than the Israel of the 1950s or 1960s was. But the essence of Obama's remark was, I like a certain kind of Israel, which is like saying, I like someone, if you were to ask some European person, what do you think of the United States? They say, I love the America of Duke Ellington and, Thomas Jefferson, the America of McDonald's, big corporations, hedge funds, everything else. No, I hate that, right? You would instantly realize that, well, that's kind of us, and if you don't like that part, you can't simply say, I just happen to, you're the ugliest guy I've ever seen. Your shoes, however, are beautiful, I don't mean that personally. So that's I think, that's a consideration. Not to say, well, I only like Israel if it meets my specifications. Right? That's a very important part of it. To say, I like Israel because this is a country that, having existed in a perpetual state of emergency, has nonetheless been the most democratic, the most exclusive, the most progressive, the most fair-minded country in the entire region, and really among the most fair-minded countries in the entire world, and has done so with its proverbial back to the wall, and that ought to command profound respect, not only on account of by Jews or by right-wingers, but especially on the left. That would be a big part of it. A second thing is to understand, it's not simply that we're for Israel because the Holocaust happened and we can't allow that to happen again. It's also to understand that Israel is the only true strategic asset we have in the Middle East. Tomorrow, Jordan could be an enemy of the United States. Saudi Arabia could be an enemy of the United States. Egypt could be an enemy of the United States. The one country in the region that no matter what, who's elected, what happens, is always going to be fundamentally pro-American is the Jewish state. It's the only one. So it's the only actually reliable ally that we have in the region. A third point, you mentioned Pat Buchanan in another context. Buchanan used to say things like, why do we have to send our sons abroad to Iraq to do the bidding of the Likud. That's his kind of, Buchanan's version of a non-anti-Semitic comment. The truth is that American soldiers have died for the sake of Iraqis, Kuwaitis, Saudis, Afghans, Somalis, Bosnians, Koreans. Not a single American soldier, as far as I am aware, has ever died defending Israel. It's amazing to think that we still have tens of thousands of troops defending the English, the Germans, the Japanese, and Koreans, very wealthy countries all. Israel is our one ally, which we can be fairly confident is going to be able to defend itself. That is a great strategic asset. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it would be nice to hear the next president explain that's why we're for that country.
That's a very... I think the reward for deftly tackling that question is for me to ask you a question that has absolutely no partisan overtones or undertones. Okay, so this is purely at the level of geopolitical strategy for Israel and its current status in the Middle East. With Iran's increasing prominence in the region, it's safe to say some analysts have pointed out that Israel might be able to forge close relations with the foursome of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, and those are not all to be put on the same par with one another. Turkey is perhaps the most awkward, but what possibilities do you see perhaps opening up for Israel to be able to shore up its status in the region by forging close relations with those four countries?
It was remarkable. I had a meeting with senior Arab diplomats. I won't go any further describing them. And they were talking about the region. And there I was sitting there listening to this description over dinner as the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. And they never mentioned Israel once or the Palestinians once as an issue that has to be resolved, not even rhetorically. B, I agreed with their strategic analysis almost completely. So if I'm a relatively good stand-in, ideologically speaking, for, I don't know, standard Israeli cabinet minister or something, it was striking to me. I mean, that was my takeaway. So you have this confluence of interests. The problem is Erdogan, the Saudis, these guys are bastards. So you run into that. I mean, what was so extraordinary about Sadat? Sadat understood that strategically he needed the United States and he also needed Israel. And he was able not only to understand what he needed strategically, but he was able to summon the emotional wherewithal to act on that in some extraordinarily public way, by flying to Jerusalem, by giving his speech, by the Camp David Accords. I don't see Erdogan, who is a flaming anti-Semite, having the personality to do that. I don't know, but I doubt that anyone in the current leadership of Saudi Arabia could bring themselves to do that, because they'd say, well, look how Sadat ended up, right? And that's why I think that even as there's this confluence of interests that can be very productive at a sort of closed door sessions, it's never going to reach the point where the Saudis are going to say, you know what, let's just find a way to quickly settle the Palestinian issue, and in a way that seems equitable, but Israel can live with, and let's have a new concordat with the Jewish state, because this state that we've spent the last 70 years demonizing turns out to be the whole key to our security. That's where statesmanship comes in, right? You can have all kinds of strategic, confluences, but if you don't have a statesman who is willing to rise to the logic of his conclusions, you're never going to get anywhere. And so this is, I think, the great question now before us. Is this young prince, who's more and more of the power in Saudi Arabia, does he have it within him to do it? Is there any future in Turkey? I doubt it after they just shut down the paper, where you're not going to have a leadership that just, what's Erdogan's problem? He hates Jews. He says it all the time in so many words. So I'm not expecting great things.
I think it's time for us to open up the floor to questions. Go ahead, yes, in the front.
I'm interested in your comments about the Supreme Court, because it greatly troubles me, because we cannot have a court that has Republicans and Democrats, you know, in name, like we have in Congress. Supreme Court may have people who are more conservative or have different viewpoints on many cases, but it now seems to be coming down to a thing that's very dangerous for the country, where they say left wing, right wing on the Supreme Court, which is against everything we've stood for. So I'd appreciate your comments.
I think there's been a clear ideological division on the court for at least 50 years, if not more. That's just the reality that we have. That's the reality of politics. You know, don't forget that the court was politicized nearly from its inception when you had a Chief Justice by the name of John Marshall, an ardent Federalist whose biggest opponent was this fellow named Thomas Jefferson. I mean, this is the court. It's wrong to think of the court as sort of an institution that's above politics. Maybe that's how in some idealized world you might want to see it as, but it's never been above politics, for better or for worse. Now, the interesting question, of course, is should Republicans accede to Obama's demands to have a nominee given an up or down vote? The reality is that anyone that the president nominates is going to be on a kamikaze mission. And I feel sorry for anyone who agrees to perform that mission. And it's, you know, we can have a kind of a long debate as to whether the person deserves an up or down vote, but there's no way that any Obama nominee is going to get a fair hearing. So maybe it's best to postpone it to the next administration, which, by the way things are looking, is likely to be a Democratic administration.
If, as I think one can argue, both Republicans and Democrats have failed large parts of the American working class, divide down the mobility, which you alluded to, why shouldn't they vote for Trump? I mean, how many factory jobs have been lost? What's happened to these people? Why shouldn't they be resentful? What should they do?
Well, it's like saying the mainstream parties have failed us, therefore I will choose something even more disastrous to the interests of working class people. It is, in fact, I mean, I'm loath to agree with anything Justin Trudeau says, just because I can't stand someone my age who's already running a country. It is simply a fact that free trade is an immense boon to American employment. Now, of course, a free trade agreement means that employment in company X may diminish, but in sector Y is going to vastly increase. But if you look at, you know, the United States since NAFTA has generally had remarkably low unemployment in an era of expanding free trade. As a matter of fact, the case that manufacturing has somehow plummeted in the United States was largely true in the 70s and 80s, as the cost of manufacturing in the United States became increasingly prohibitive for a variety of reasons. But we've had a manufacturing renaissance in this country in the last few years, and you have to go to towns like Youngstown, Ohio, you know, so-called Rust Belt cities, Toledo, Ohio, Nashville, all these places that are seeing manufacturing jobs come back. So Donald Trump is selling that factory worker, working class Americans, a total bill of goods, claiming that the reason, you know, Jim or Sally has lost their job is that some factory worker in Mexico has stolen it from them. That's just simply not true. It's a lie. And so, you know, the argument that Democrats and Republicans, and by the way, I don't think Democrats and Republicans have simply completely failed the United States. Compared to whom? Have you looked at economic figures in Japan, economic figures in Europe, economic figures anywhere else in the world? By and large, and again, I say this as a real critic of the Obama administration, who thinks this has been a pretty lousy presidency, but the Americans have largely thrived in the era of free trade, have largely thrived in an era of laissez-faire, so-called laissez-faire economics. You know, the average, if you look at gross domestic product per capita in the United States, since the Bretton Woods agreements of the 1940s, since the modern era of economics, it's been an era of incredible prosperity. Lots of problems, but incredible prosperity. Now, there are all kinds of other issues that need to be dealt with. But the suggestion, and you know, mobility is a huge issue in the United States, and there are all kinds of factors that go into accounting for labor mobility issues. But the suggestion that somehow the answer to that is let's start a trade war with China is crazy, is absolutely insane. And by the way, speaking of the lessons of the 1930s, and I didn't get into this in the column for want of space, but it used to be the case that we had a literate enough public that when you mentioned the term smoot-hawley, people understood what that meant and how badly that protectionist impulse deepened the depression of the 1930s and created trade wars and created the conditions which ultimately led or helped lead to the Second World War. So having all kinds of problems doesn't mean, you know, Vicodin has failed you and yoga has failed you, become a heroin addict. You know, it's not the solution.
I want to take exception to your comment when the 10-to-1 topic came up in terms of taxes, and your answer, which I felt was a rather blanket, the American people are taxed too much. And I say that because, at least in my opinion, there has been a real diminishment in the sense of duty to country and national service, and the fact that all of us may have to pay more to improve the health and well-being of the country. As an example, I'm a retired physician, and during the Vietnam War, I had to give 2 years of my life to serve in the Army. And I did so willingly, and I think it became a better citizen because of it, because you had a sense of dedication to the country. I fail to understand why the argument that the American people are taxed too much holds water when you have disparity of income, when you have a situation where you could have a graduated tax that could go toward restoring infrastructure in the sense that that is a national crisis, perhaps as significant to our eventual economic health of the country as is a war. And I don't understand why the concept of a tax in a graduated and appropriate sense, with appropriate monitoring of governmental projects, is such a terrible thing to impose for the time it may take to solve the problem.
It's an excellent question. I'm grateful you asked it. A couple of points. I would have no problem with tax increases if you could show me good evidence that those increases would lead to greater economic efficiencies, health, equitable distribution of incomes. If there was a case that you could make to me that if we jack up tax rates to European levels, we're going to be a healthier society. Having lived in Europe and having children who have European passports, I just don't see the social democratic promise yielding anything other than vast amounts of national debt, terrible allocation of capital, huge unemployment problems, huge problems is not only just unemployment, but youth unemployment in particular. So if there were empirical evidence that Scandinavian methods could lead to terrific outcomes, I'd take it. Who wouldn't, right? I mean, this is an empirical question. I guess my problem is that you are, or I guess where I disagree with you, is you're saying, well, this would be a kind of sacrifice on a par with my national service. It would make us better. If in fact it made us better, I'd agree with it. On the other hand, where I do agree with you is to say, why is it the case that no one in America, or so few young people in America, ever feel any kind of need to have any kind of national service? Have we really well served the country by getting rid of the draft, by getting rid of any form of national service, or any concept that we're in this together? And so, I mean, I think they're terrific arguments. I mean, all kinds of people would have different views, but there are very powerful arguments for having some kind of national service. Why? Because it makes us better citizens and probably better human beings. I don't think, where I disagree with you is the substitution, well, if you're not going to have national service, then pony up some more money. And then one final point, where you said, if we have I forgot the phrase, you said well-regulated or properly overseen infrastructure projects. I would love for someone to point me to the example of the properly overseen infrastructure project, because I live within sight of Ground Zero, and have for the past 11 years. And to me, that is an emblem of what happens when you have great big infrastructure projects, and what happens to them in the modern day, especially when you have an organization like the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey involved in these sorts of things. So, this is, it's a great question to ask, why can't we put men on the moon anymore, right? Why don't we have that ethos in this country of the kind that we had after World War II? It's a long answer to that, but God help us if we become a country dedicated to great infrastructure projects, because man, are we going to waste a whole lot of money on a whole lot of nothing really quickly. Look, I am comparatively happier when most Jews vote the Democratic Party ticket. And I say this as someone who last voted for a Democrat in 1992. And there's a guy there whose mouth has just fallen to the ground. But let me explain what I mean. I think the great danger for Israel vis-a-vis American politics is that the Democratic Party should become a captive to its most leftward impulses. And to the extent that Jews who say are pro-choice or whatever, will agree with Democrats on all kinds of issues but are strongly pro-Israel, to the degree that they provide ballast in the Democratic Party to make sure that that party remains solidly committed to Israel's security and understands why it's solidly committed, that's a great thing. And so, I profoundly believe in the necessity of bipartisan support for Israel. And quite frankly, the most terrifying phenomenon for me in the last 7 years has been watching this kind of leftward drift in the Democratic Party, so to the point that I think it's on the edge of abandoning any real support for Israel. You mentioned J Street. And again, this is one of these organizations which essentially allows you to be, quote, pro-Israel, except that you hold views diametrically opposed to 85% of Israelis, including the current leader of the Labor Party, who just said the other day, we will never get out of Ariel, which is one of the biggest settlements in the West Bank. I think, those of you who are in this room who are pro-Israel and Democrats, stay that way. And talk to your Democratic friends and say, hey, listen, if you're for gay rights, the only country that's
supporting them in the Middle East is Israel. If you believe in women's rights, the only place you want to be a woman is in Israel. If you care for the environment, the only country that gives a damn about its environment is Israel. It's so forth and so on. It's idiotic to be a liberal and be anti-Israel. It's often idiotic to be a liberal, but that's another story. All right, I'm sorry to those I offended. But that's hugely, I think it's hugely important that that decent people on both sides of the political divide understand that Israel joins American values and American interests in a way that exists almost nowhere else in the world, and that ought to commend their unwavering and serious support. And I guess the last point I would make is this one, and I know I'm throwing way too much time. Israel is not a vanity for American Jews. One of the reasons why a lot of American Jews suddenly become uncomfortable with Israel, or they become neuralgic when the subject of settlements comes up, or some Israeli policy which makes them feel uncomfortable, is that to them, I think, most of politics is vanity. And so they want, to the extent that they're Jewish and they feel implicated in Israel's existence, they want Israel to be this spotless little country that they can wear like a beautiful coat that will only make them look well. But in fact, Israel didn't come into existence to make diaspora Jews feel better about themselves. Israel came into existence to protect Jewish lives and Jewish honor. And doing so means being involved in political life, and often in the choice of evils that political life entails, that will not necessarily provide those diaspora Jews with their spotless coats so that they can feel terrific all the time and say, I'm pro-Israel the way that I'm pro-environment, or other, no-brainer political affiliations, right? And American Jews and diaspora Jews owe it to the Jews of Israel to say, you have made your life there, we're proud of you, every day of your life is difficult. Every choice you make is difficult. And we are going to respect the fact and honor the fact that you are making difficult choices in a difficult place, and treat you with the high respect that entails as we live immeasurably more comfortable lives here in Greenwich, Connecticut. I think that's the attitude for American Jews, Democratic or Republican or whatever, to take. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.